Hey Titans, this is Mordecai from GamerTitan.com. In this video, we're going to be going over how to use require when you are coding in Core. So let's go ahead and hop into Core. So first off, what is require and why would you want to use it? So if you're doing any form of code and you're having to reuse a function quite often, if it's just in the same script, it's okay to just go ahead and obviously put the function in that script. However, there may be situations where there is some function that you're going to be using throughout a lot of scripts. And one of the options is to use what's called require. And so let's go ahead and open up a test script here. Let's do test script server. And we'll keep this very high level. So first we'll just do a normal function. We'll just do, let's call it test warn. Pass in a string, and then there's no real reason to make this function, but you'll see. Or actually, let's go ahead and let's do something a little bit better than this. Let's do alright, it's not much better, but it'll get the job done. So now if we just do this, it'll say hi something else, right? So we throw this into the game, we play it, it says hi something else. So I guess a better example, instead of just using a print, would be what I use a lot is I usually in code will make a function that is a valid player. So like valid player, and then what I do is I just return player and object is valid, player and object is a player. So let's zoom this out a bit. And actually, let's just make this a bit more scalable. Let's call it object, because we're unsure if it's a player at this point. Okay, so that's a local function. And so right now, it's just in the server script, as an example. And so if I wanted to actually access this in multiple scripts currently, with how I have it set up, so let's make another script. And we'll just make it test client. If I wanted to use that same function, I have no access to it currently. I would have to literally copy and paste it. And so this is a good example because this is actually what require basically allows you to do. And so there's one extra step that you have to do. So instead of copying and pasting common functions that you use in your code over and over and over, what you would do is you would make a new script. So it would be a third script in this case, and you would name it test API, or well, you can name it whatever you want. But in this case, I usually make anything that I'm going to use as require or through globals, I will namespace it with API at the end. And so what we would do is we would actually make test API. The first thing we need to do is we need to make a table up at the top. And so what you do is we'll just name it API. And then at the end of the script, you return API. And so now what we can do is we can take this function, we can paste it in here, and all we do is put API in front of it. And so in Lua, what this is allowing us to do is we're creating a table, we're adding this function to the table, and then we're returning the table. And so now that we have this test API, I guess what I should do is on the server, just real quick, we'll do game.on player joined event connect on player joined. And this is just so we can test that this is working. And so what we're going to do is do if object is, or if player is valid player, then we'll do is valid server. And the reason I'm doing this is just to prove that this function is in fact working. And so what we'll do is press play and it says is valid server. So we got it right there. And so now we created our require. And I know this is very hard to see, I apologize. We created our require script. So now all we have to do is, if we're wanting to use this function in our server script, what we would do is we would go to where we have this script. Where is this script? It's under default floor. I don't know how that happened. Okay. So we take test server, and what we would do is we would drag test API in as a custom property. And so now what we do is we copy this, we go into test server, and up at the very top of test server, we paste in our custom property, and all you have to do is wrap it in require. And then we can just name this API as an example. So now what we can do is we could go ahead and delete this on this side, and we would just put API in front of it, and we should get the same result. So what's happening is when the script is loaded in, the very first line says we need to require this other script. This other script then runs. It creates a table called API. It creates this function, it attaches it to the table, and then it returns to API. So now this function is an API in this script, which allows us to call it here. And how we call it is, because we named it API here, we just need to call API is valid player. So here we are. So now if I save this and I run it, we got is valid server as a print. So now the same thing is true if we wanted to do this on client. So instead of having this, we would just do, once again, we would drag our test API in, we would grab our custom property, we put it up at the top here. And by the way, in this script, it can be named whatever you want. It doesn't have to be named API. And so as an example, we can name it test. And so the difference is, just to kind of show you, what we'll do is we'll do local player equals game dot get local player, and then we're going to task dot wait 5 seconds, and we're going to do test dot is valid player local player. We're going to wrap it, we're going to put it in an if because it's a boolean. It turns true if it's true. And then we're going to do print client is valid. Okay, so even though this script hasn't changed, it's still API, it returns API. On this side, because we are putting it in the variable in this script as test, we then put test in front. So let's go ahead and run this. Client only side namespace, and that is because I didn't put this in client. So put that in client context and try it again. So we got is valid server, and then after 5 seconds, it should print, which it didn't. Attempt call no value. Let's try it again. There we go. That was odd. I must have had a typo on the other side. And so, as you can see, both scripts now, both of our client and our server, are using it through this. And so require is very, very useful, and it allows you to scale up your code. So if there is a lot of functions that you're using, or if there's functions that you're using throughout your project quite frequently, then I would suggest putting it in your own API and then using require to access those. So one thing to note though is if for whatever reason you needed to change a function, just be aware, as an example, because it's used in those two scripts now, if I put not object, then none of this would actually print in both the client and the server, because it is in fact changing it on both. And so this allows for scalability. However, there are some caveats to be aware of that, you know, if you're editing, then it does it in everywhere that you've required that. So I know this was kind of a quick video, and it was, in terms of like my windows here, it was kind of hard to follow perhaps. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful. I know it was kind of a shotgun approach to a video, but require, when I wrapped my head around it early on, once I kind of figured out how that worked, it opened up the ability for me to actually read code from community content a lot easier. And one of the ways I learned how to code was definitely by going through other creators' code and being able to understand the basics of like how these things are working and how this is called is very, very helpful. And so just be aware that if you ever see something that's like API dot, you know, is valid player, or, you know, whatever function, check up at the top of that script to see if there's any requires, and then be aware of what variable those requires are stored in. And then you'll know that that's where that function is actually, that's where that function actually lives. That's how it's actually being called. And so one other thing is, it doesn't have to be just functions in this. You could also do constants. And so as an example, if we just do constant equals GamerTitan. So now what we could do is, instead of printing is valid server, we could copy this over here, and then we'll put it here as well. And just like the function, because it's a constant, oh, we named this one test, it will now say GamerTitan is a, oh, well, actually no, it won't, because remember, we put this not here. And so that means that it was the opposite on both of those scripts. So we'll take that out again. And GamerTitan is a valid server, and then it'll say GamerTitan is a valid client. So right in the logs there. And so this is very helpful for allowing you to have like a constants file. So a constants file I usually use for like game settings. So if there's resource names that I'm using in a lot of different places, I'll actually make a constants file. That way, if for whatever reason later on throughout the development of the project, I want to rename for whatever reason the resource, instead of having it manually throughout the project, I would just change it in one place. And then if I use this constant properly throughout the rest of the code, by changing it here, it would change it everywhere and nothing would break. So there's a lot of value in being able to set up your own APIs and use them, like I said, not only for functions, but also constants and tables and all sorts of stuff. So you could also do a table within a table. And so you would do like API table, and then that could be another table, and then that could be a bunch of constants. So like, so as an example, to access this one, it would be test constant table dot test, and that would return test1 to the client in this case. And I know that it looks weird, test.table.test, but it's essentially accessing test, which is a table, which is API on this side, and then it's a nested table because it's dot table, and then inside that is a value called test. And so now we'll get test1. So GamerTitan is valid server, and then it will say test1 is valid client is valid, which it did. So hopefully that was helpful. You will see required used quite a bit throughout projects. If you're downloading anything from, CC and code, if you're using any of the actual core components, there's a lot of components that use require. And this was one thing that I definitely struggled with early on as a creator. So once again, if you have any questions or comments, please do so in the comments down below. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up. And if you want more core related content, please hit that sub button. I'll catch you next time, Titans.